Okay, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to this webinar on how to pre-think assumptions. My name is Rajat Sadana. I'm one of the co-founders of e-GMAT, and I'm going to be a main host today. Helping me in this webinar, we have two e-GMATers. We have Sandeep, who's a senior GMAT strategy expert, and Harsha, who's a senior SME. They're going to both support me during this webinar. They're going to make sure that your questions, any question that you have during the course of this webinar, is answered to your satisfaction. In this webinar, we're going to talk about, we will first learn the process of pre-thinking, and then we'll learn how to apply the process of pre-thinking to some of the most challenging questions on the GMAT. The goal of this webinar is not to kind of make sure that you answer every question correctly, but to impart learning from every exercise that you do during this webinar. Overall, it's a very, very application-focused webinar, and it's because pre-thinking is a skill that's extremely essential to you succeeding on critical reasoning. And if you go look at GMAT Club reviews, one thing that you'd observe just for the month of August, if you just focus on the month of August, is that we've delivered more 700 plus scores in August than everyone else combined. In fact, we've delivered twice as many 700 plus scores. And as you read those reviews, what you're going to find is when it comes to folks who needed help in critical reasoning, they will talk about this one term called pre-thinking, which is what you're going to learn today. Now, since it's a fairly application-focused session, we did send a few video lessons your way. They are on the top left-hand corner, starting from Introduction to Assumption to Pre-thinking Logical Gap and Pre-thinking Two Entities. The two video lessons, the three video lessons, or what we call as trackable X-Learn activities that actually give you that foundation in pre-thinking, give you that foundation in visualization and an argument structure. If you've not gone through these video lessons, go through them post this webinar. They are a part of your free trial. For those of you who are, of course, e-GMAT students, you guys have access to the entire suite of pre-thinking tools, not just these three lessons. Okay, with that, we have some other free sessions. Tomorrow, the 29th of August, we have a number properties webinar. This webinar very specifically focuses on divisibility and remainders, or remainders to be actually very specific. This is what I call as a 0 to 100 webinar, where we start from the very basics with the remainder equation and move on to teach you how to solve 700 level questions. In fact, very, very difficult data sufficiency questions in this. So over the course of 2 hours, you go from 0 to 100. Then we have a strategy webinar. That's next Saturday, exactly a week from now. One of our most popular webinars. It actually, in this webinar, we talk about the blueprint of a successful GMAT journey, starting from what we call as building your own personalized study plan to defining how to track your improvement and how to course correct if you're not improving during that process, and going to that end point where we look at the final push, which is what we call as a test readiness phase, and we discuss some of the common misconceptions around the GMAT, such as the first 10 questions, such as when to make mistakes, what happens when you make mistakes, and so on and so forth. So again, that's next Saturday on 4th of September at 7 a.m. Pacific. And then this week we also have an excellent webinar from which is hosted, or rather, in which Donna Levinson, who's the Dean of Admissions at MIT Sloan, she is going to talk about how to craft your MBA, your application for the Sloan Masters program. Last week we had Adcom from IESC. This week we have Donna, who's from the Sloan Masters program. Again, you can click on this to get your session pass. Okay. With that, let's kind of get to know you guys a bit better. So generally ask two questions. One is, when do you plan to take the test? And the next one is, what is your target GMAT score? Let me ask that next question over here. Just clear all answers because we had one prior response, and let's get that. Now, with regards to when do people plan to take the GMAT, what I can see is, the biggest group over here hasn't taken the date here. That's about 39 of you. Then we have a significant number of you in that 40 to 75 and 31 to 45 days. Is about another 55 of you. And then we have about 46, 47 of you who have the test within the next 30 days or so. Now, pre-thinking is something which requires intense focus, but if you do provide intense focus, you can actually master it in about 5 to 7 days. That's kind of how long it takes. So even those of you 15 days, you guys are in a good position to make a significant impact on your CR outcomes. With regards to the target GMAT scores, 730 to 750 bracket is the biggest group. 760 plus about 20% or 16%, give or take, over here. Again, that's really good to know. If you are an international student who wants to get into a top B school, 750 is that new 700. So if you're looking for a top 20 school, that's a score that we recommend. It gets you admits. It actually increases your chances of admits by about 3x. But majority of people who actually get to a 750 also get some form of scholarship. So I think it just pays dividend to get to that score. Okay, with that, let's go right into the webinar pane. The screen will have changed for you. Let me just put in a generic yes/no poll. And what I want you to do is I want you to select yes if you can see CR1 pre-thinking for assumptions. All right, it seems pretty much most of you can see that. That's excellent. Now, what you see over here is a presentation pane, and below that you have a Q&A or a question and answer pod. And so during the webinar, if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask those questions in the Q&A pod. The reason why Harsha and Sandeep are here is because so that you guys can so that they can answer your questions. Now, one thing that I'd recommend is keep those questions relevant to the topics that we're talking about, because essentially, you know, we'd go in real deep. We'll be very intense with the session, because this is a fairly application focused session. So if you ask a question that's not related to this, to what we're talking about, you know, both Harsha and Sandeep will have difficulty doing justice to that question. We're going to start right from the second part of the webinar. Let me actually get my annotations on. So we're going to start right from the second part of the webinar. We're going to skip that. And then what this would do is towards the end, if you have questions which are about your MBA, about your GMAT preparation, about questions about, hey, how do I use the e-GMAT course, or is the e-GMAT course the right course for me? We're going to reserve about 20 minutes towards the end, where you can ask those questions, and I and Sandeep and Harsha can focus exclusively on answering those questions. That way, you know, during the learning phase, we will learn, and then during that, and you can ask good questions about the content that you're learning. That's something that should happen over here. But when it comes to the other pieces over here, I'd say reserve them to this part in this case. Okay, with that, let me actually skip a few slides, because we have the first part here, and go right into this piece here. And hold on. So one thing that I want you to do, let's kind of go a couple of slides back in this case, is, you know, I like to connect with students, and one thing that I like you to do is connect with me on my LinkedIn. You know, we post about 5 to 7 articles every week on LinkedIn. We also post 2 success stories on our YouTube channel. So if you want to stay updated with all things e-GMAT, if you want to connect with students at various top business schools, then that would be, you know, a great way. So I have the link to that. So with that, let's go right into the core of this session. Just as an outline, what is it that we're going to do? Again, remember, the goal for this session is to make sure that you understand what pre-thinking is, and for those of you who already follow pre-thinking, to make you better pre-thinkers. So we're going to first start with a baseline understanding of where you guys are today. How many of you do practice pre-thinking? How many of you actually follow some other approach? Then we're going to do what we call as a foundation of pre-thinking, or we call this a pre-thinking exercise, but this really is a foundation where we talk about what is pre-thinking, how do you apply it. We do this through about 3 to 4 questions. And 2 of them are just arguments, 2 of them are full length questions. And then after that, we actually apply, once you understand what an assumption is, what pre-thinking is, we apply that to 2 very challenging questions, probably the most challenging official questions that you will see. We solve those questions as a quiz, and then we do a detailed review of these questions. So that's going to be about 80% of the webinar. So of the learning part of the webinar. That's going to be about 80% of that. And then we look at, okay, now that you've tasted or had a taste of what pre-thinking is, what should you do next? What should be the next steps that you should take to cement this approach and enhance your learning? Okay. At a very high level, we'll start with how you prepare today, then we'll build those core skills, and then we'll look at how should you cement those core skills and get to that 90th percentile. Okay. With that, let's talk about your current approach to critical reasoning, and I'm going to actually show two approaches here. Here is the poll question. I'm going to talk about two methodologies, and I want you to tell me which methodology do you follow. Let me just remove broadcast results. But before we do that, one thing that I want to tell you is what pre-thinking is. And pre-thinking, a lot of people, when it comes to pre-thinking, think about it as predicting the answer. A lot of people also call it some sort of a black magic or so. It actually isn't. It's a very simplified process. And the goal of pre-thinking is that you look at, when you read an argument, you think about one potential assumption in your mind before you look at answer choices. Now, this is pre-thinking when it comes to assumption questions. If it comes to strengthen, weaken, or evaluate questions, you actually choose a corresponding answer choice. In strengthen, you'd use you'll pre-think one strengthener. In weaken questions, you'll pre-think one weakener. Or so in evaluate questions, you'd pre-think one way to evaluate the answer choice. In fact, pre-thinking also applies to boldface questions. So again, let me reiterate the key pieces over here. Your goal is to focus and figure out one potential assumption. An argument can have multiple assumptions. Your job is not to figure out each one of those assumptions. Once you become a skilled pre-thinker, you'd be able to do this in about 15 seconds, and you have to do this before you look at the answer choices. The moment you look at answer choices, you can throw pre-thinking out of the window. Again, the goal is not to predict the answer. The goal of pre-thinking is that you distill the logic that the author uses. And the reason why this is important is because, pre-thinking as a term has existed, but there was no formal process that ever existed. We were actually the first company, and I believe still the only company that has created a formal process. And so I think I want to make sure that you look at this, because when you hear other experts talk about pre-thinking, they're really not talking about pre-thinking in this notion. Okay, so how do you go about approaching a CR question today? So there are two ways in which people generally do this. One is the pre-thinking approach, which is option number 2, where you read the argument, pre-think the assumption, and then evaluate the answer choices. The second is you read the argument, you quickly read the argument, which is option number 1 over here. You go to the answer choices and you do that back and forth between the argument and the answer choices till you reach the final candidate. So my question to you is, which methodology you follow? This is the pre-thinking approach. This is a not pre-thinking approach. So as of today, where are you guys? Put in your answers. Let's get at least 50 answers. I have about 48, 49, 50 answers. I'm going to broadcast results, and so that you guys can actually start seeing those answers come in. So which methodology do you follow? Is it the non-pre-thinking approach, which is methodology 1, or the pre-thinking approach, that is methodology 2? So good, we have a 60-40 split, which is slightly different than what we usually have. Normally I have a 50-50 split, but again, every group's unique, and this group's unique as well, about 150 students here. So my goal with those who follow methodology 1, my goal today will be to make sure that those who follow methodology 1, which is the non-pre-thinking approach, for you to kind of help you guys believe in this approach. The second thing, those who actually already follow the pre-thinking approach, I want to kind of iron out the kinks in your approach to make sure that that you guys become better pre-thinkers and hopefully get to that 90th percentile faster. Okay. Now, pre-thinking doesn't exist in isolation. It actually is something that is, as a process, is built on top of certain core skills that you need to have when it comes to solving CR questions. So what are those core skills? One of the most important core skills is the skill to visualize, and essentially this is a skill that's really important in CR. It's really important in RC, and for those of you who are quant students, would also recognize this as very important in quant as well. What does this mean? This is a skill where, when you think about, when you read a statement, you should be able to imagine that scenario happening in your brain. And there are two entities in an argument that you need to really focus a lot on. One is the conclusion, and the second is an answer choice. A lot of people who actually do a great job with the argument still end up making mistakes. Why? Because they fail to do the skill. If you're an e-GMAT student, if you've gone through a strategic review process, you actually recognize this piece. The second thing that we're going to focus on is understanding the logic that the author uses. We're going to focus, and these two things are going to be done independent of one another. And so, which is where what we're going to really say is, okay, what is the claim that the author is making? Every argument has a claim. And then what's the basis of the claim? What facts has the author presented, and how does the author link those facts to this conclusion? And once we understand this, this is when the pre-thinking process comes in. This is when we will formulate what we call as a falsification question. And you're going to learn all of these things over here. Okay. Let me just make sure. Good. So with that, I'm going to ask you guys one other question, which is, let's kind of make sure we all understand what the word assumption is. So I'm going to give you a very, very simple argument. Why? Because assumption as a term is very natural to all of us. Even if you understand the context that we are talking about, we can figure out what an assumption is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a very, very simple argument. I want you to put your assumption in here. Okay, here's a very simple argument. Tell me, what does the author assume here? Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Well, thank you guys. This is great. Excellent participation. I truly appreciate that. We got many answers. We got about 50 answers over here or so, which is excellent. Now, some of you have many of you have actually gotten the answer correct. This is great. So the folks who say Ivy Leagues require more than 500, that's an excellent answer. Okay, as Ivy Leagues require a GMAT score more than above 500 to be considered. That's great. So that's all of those of you who've actually answered along those lines. You guys are great. Then there's some of you who've actually restated facts, which is Joe scored 500 on the GMAT. You've said that is the assumption. That's a fact. That's something that's given to you. Some of you have restated the conclusion. Some of you've stated something that is not the core idea, but it's a related idea, and statements such as GMAT is the main point when it comes to admission, GMAT is the only criteria for admission. Those are related ideas, but not strictly assumptions. And we're going to discuss why that is the case in the course of this session. Okay, so let's kind of look at what's going on in this argument here. The author gives you a fact. He says, hey, Joe scored 500 on the GMAT. If you just read this line without considering the next line, you say, okay, this is a data point that's given to me. And then based on this data point, the author makes a claim or a conclusion, which is that therefore, and this is a conclusion marker or a claim marker, he will not get admission in an Ivy League college. He makes a conclusion, and what kind of a conclusion is it? It's a prediction into the future. And so essentially when he does that, the author kind of does some sort of a logical jump. Now, what's that logical jump? The logical jump, which is the assumption that's here, is that a score of 500 on the GMAT for someone like Joe is unacceptable to Ivy League colleges. Now, he has pretty much got the logic here. I think the only piece that most of you did not get is this aspect over here, which is for someone like Joe. Why does it have to be for someone like Joe? Because in his conclusion, the author is talking about Joe, not the Prince of Saudi Arabia. So you know, the Prince of Saudi Arabia might get into an Ivy League college, but Joe definitely will not, as per the author. Okay, so with that, so that was just a warm-up idea to kind of tell you that a majority of us can think about assumptions or do what we call as pre-thinking. What you did was pre-thinking right there. If we understand the argument properly, if we can visualize the conclusion, and this was a context that you probably have visualized day in and day out for the last couple of weeks or couple of months, depending on how long you've been preparing, and which is where assumption was natural to me, or was natural to you, I'm sorry. So with having said that, what do you think is the definition of an assumption? Can you tell me what's the technical definition of an assumption? Can you write it down? Let's get some other answer, a few other answers. Okay. The question is, what is the definition of an assumption? That is great. Okay. 36 responses, 37. One of the other things, guys, I see some of you posting your responses in the Q&A pod. Please don't post that. The Q&A pod is for your questions, not for your responses, which is why we have this short answer pod, which is on the right hand side. Okay, so some of you actually have said, you know, are very close to the definition, something that should be true for the conclusion to hold true. That's very close to the correct definition of an assumption. Those of you saying it's an inference and assumption are actually completely opposite, or what we call as mutually exclusive. An inference is something that you can get based on what's given in the argument and assumed in the argument to be true. An assumption is something that must be true. Both inference and assumption are must be true. They have this commonality, but when it comes to yeah, I'm not going to go into the technical details because I think we're going to go on a tangent here, but inference and assumption in many ways just are mutually exclusive. I've actually written an article on inference versus assumption, I think, if you search for it on our blog. Unstated facts which connects a premise to a conclusion. An assumption is an unstated fact that connects a premise to a conclusion, but every unstated fact that connects a premise to the conclusion is not an assumption over here. Okay, something I predict what might happen, not necessarily, because yeah. So let's kind of talk about what an assumption is, and you know, normally I don't ask you guys to write things down because writing things down, a lot of things down, doesn't lead to any good. But in this session, I'm going to ask you to write 3 things down. Why? Because if you remember those 3 things, you should be able to answer every question that the test throws at you. An assumption is an unstated idea that must be true for the conclusion to be valid. And this is, just write this definition down. Why? Because as we solve questions, you guys are going to make mistakes. And when you make mistakes, I'm going to ask you to reiterate this definition, and you're going to figure out why you made a mistake, where you made a mistake. Okay. It's an unstated idea that must satisfy this one condition, what we call as must be true condition. For what? For the conclusion to remain valid. Okay. And let's kind of distill it down. So the very fact that the assumption is an unstated idea means that an assumption, you cannot infer an assumption from the information given in the argument, which is why assumption and inference are mutually exclusive. You can't infer an assumption from what's given as factual in the argument. Okay. The second thing is the assumption must be required for the conclusion to hold true, or in other words, without the assumption, there is a possibility that the conclusion breaks down. Okay. A correct answer choice will satisfy both these conditions. Some people say, hey, an assumption is an unstated premise. Yes, every assumption is an unstated premise, but every unstated premise is not an assumption. In many ways, you can really say, hey, for the last 10 years, and again, I don't remember the stat exactly, but let's kind of assume that's true. For the last 10 years, everyone who has won the Formula One race has driven a Ferrari, but you know, everyone who is, which kind of is saying every assumption is an unstated premise, but everyone who has driven a Ferrari has not won the Formula One race, which means every unstated premise is not an assumption. Okay. Does that make sense? Would the unstated premise versus assumption? Every assumption is an unstated premise, but every unstated premise is not an assumption. which means the unstated premise is a much bigger set than the set of assumptions for those of you who actually understand the math behind sets. Yes, no, you can type it down in the short answer pod here. Perfect. Okay. All right. So how do you visualize this must be true and an unstated premise piece over here? Okay. So think of this house, and this is where a lot of what we're going to do in this session is going to be about visualization. Think of this house as your argument. Okay. And so where your conclusion is this roof. Now, the job of an argument is to keep the conclusion intact, or in other words, you don't want the conclusion or the roof over here to cave in. Now, what you see over here are there are three pillars that are supporting the roof, or in our case, the conclusion from actually falling down. Each one of these pillars makes the integrity of this roof stronger. However, is each one of them an assumption? Is each one of them a necessary pillar? Maybe not. So if it so happens that only the central pillar is required to prevent the roof from caving in, then your assumption is only that central pillar, that is an essential pillar. The other two pillars, while they make that conclusion stronger, are not essential pillars. They are, even if you remove them, the roof will still stay upright. So that's the difference between what we call as an unstated premise. These are unstated premises which are not essential pillar. This is like that unstated premise that is an essential pillar or an assumption over here. Does that visualization make sense? And we're going to really take examples around this to prove this, because what really happens when you take an assumption question, when you make mistakes, you end up choosing one of these answer choices rather, and you end up rejecting this, and that's kind of where you make a mistake. So just from a parallel example standpoint, from a visualization standpoint, does that make sense? The assumption is that unstated pillar that's required to prevent this roof from caving in. Just remember that. All of those other attractive looking answer choices are those strengtheners, okay, but they don't satisfy that must be true condition. Okay, so just to iterate this in words, what does it mean for must be true? It means that if the information provided by assumption is not true, then there is a possibility, a scenario exists in which the conclusion can be broken down or the conclusion can be invalidated. Okay, or which it means is, which kind of goes back to the definition of assumption, the assumption must be true for the conclusion to remain valid, or for the conclusion to remain, for the conclusion not to be destroyed. Okay, so let's kind of look at this and apply this to solving the correct answer. And we're going to take this very simple argument first. The reason why we take this very simple argument, even though majority of you got the answer right, is because of this process. This process remains the same regardless of whether it's, this is what I call as a 400 level argument or whether it's a 700 level argument. And we're going to go from here to 700 level argument. We're going to follow the exact same process here. Okay, so the first thing over here, what does falsification or destroying the conclusion mean? Or in other words, in what scenario can the conclusion be destroyed? The conclusion can be destroyed if Joe gets admission with a score of 500. So if essentially there's a scenario in which Joe gets admission with a score of 500, then the author's claim is falsified. Would you guys agree? When you look at the falsification scenario, if Joe gets admission with a score of 500, the author is falsified, or his claim is invalidated. Okay. So, yes. So let's kind of look at this and say, how do we figure out whether an answer choice is correct? Now, remember, I'm not teaching you pre-thinking yet. I'm teaching you just the basics of what an assumption is, and then we'll go towards pre-thinking. So this is the statement that we said is a correct assumption, and let's see how we evaluate that over here. So this is a statement, a score of 500 on the GMAT for someone like Joe is unacceptable to Ivy League colleges. Let's ask ourselves, does it satisfy that must be true condition? Or in other words, will Joe get admission, which is my conclusion breakdown scenario, if this statement over here is no longer true? Now, here is something that you need to understand. When you say a statement is no longer true, you are by inference also saying that its negated instance is true. So when you say this statement is not true, what you're really saying is this statement automatically is true, and I'm going to explain why that happens. So what is the negated instance of this statement? A score of 500 on the GMAT for someone like Joe is acceptable to Ivy League schools. Now, when that happens, does my conclusion break down? Absolutely. Why? Because if a score of 500 becomes acceptable for someone like Joe, then the author cannot make this claim that Joe will not get admission into Ivy League college. Okay. So does the negated instance destroy my conclusion? Absolutely it does, which is kind of the hallmark of correct assumption. Okay. Now many of you may be confused to really say, when we say this statement is no longer true, then how is it that its negated instance becomes true? So let's kind of see that piece over here. Let's take a couple of statements. Okay. Let's take this statement. Harvard has the best MBA program. If you say that is not true, aren't you automatically saying that Harvard does not have the best MBA program, or that an MBA program which is better than or just as good as Harvard exists? Are you not saying this automatically when you say this is not true? Yes, no? You can type that in the short answer poll. Right? So when you say a statement is not true, by definition, you're saying its negated version is true. Okay. Let's look at another statement. John runs faster than David. If you say that's not true, what you're really saying is that David is just as fast as John, or David could also be faster than John. Right? So when you say a statement is not true, by definition, you are saying that its negated version is true. Okay. So this must be true, which means that if an answer choice is the correct assumption, then the conclusion will break down in the presence of negated version of that answer choice. Again, if you go back to that visualization of roof, what will happen if you remove an essential pillar? What happens when you remove an essential pillar from the house? What happens to the roof? It caves in, it falls. Negating the assumption is the same as removing that essential pillar, or breaking that essential pillar, and the roof will fall, which is kind of what this is over here. Okay. Now it also has the other side, which is what helps you reject incorrect answer choices. If it's an incorrect answer choice, if the answer choice is not must be true, then the conclusion will not break down in the presence of negated instance, which means if you apply this test to an incorrect answer choice, you're going to figure out that the conclusion still stays intact. And let's take an example. Same argument. The answer choice that we're going to evaluate is if a score of 500 on the GMAT is not a good score. The author is giving you as one of the options. You've got to figure out, is this the correct assumption? A score of 500 on the GMAT is not a good score. Okay, so let's kind of look at this over here and say, is this must be true? Is it required that a score of 500 be classified as not a good score, or I could also have changed it to is a bad score? Is it required that be the case? So let's look at and apply the same process and say, okay, will the conclusion become invalid? Will Joe get admission if the statement to the left is no longer true? So the negation of this is a score of 500 on the GMAT is a good score. So 500 suddenly now becomes a good score. So will Joe get admission? The answer is absolutely not. Why? Because if you think about what the author has said, he's made his claim based on this one data point. He doesn't assume that the data point to be classified as good or bad. All he's saying is because Joe scored 500 on the GMAT, he will not get admission into an Ivy League college. In other words, you can replace that data point 500 by 700. The logic that the author uses no longer changes. Okay, so this in that way is an incorrect answer choice. So that's kind of applying the negation test and fundamentals of what an assumption is. Now, one thing that you would recognize in all of this is we're going to do a lot of visualization. You understand what an assumption is, but every statement that we read, I want you to get into the habit of visualizing that statement in your own words. Why? Because as arguments get more complex, that's going to be the only way that you're going to be able to weed out the details and focus on the logic. So the first thing I want you to do is visualize what the author is saying. And in the same way, in the last argument, you should have visualized Joe not getting admission or Joe being rejected by Ivy League schools. Okay, so this was a good foundation. We spent about, what, another 15, 18 minutes on understanding the foundation. Just as a summary, if you look at evaluate and put this test on the correct answer choice, the conclusion will break down in the presence of its negated version. For the incorrect answer choice, the conclusion will continue to hold true in the presence of that negated version. That's kind of the negation test. Okay. So with that, we have a foundation of what an assumption is. Let's now start learning what pre-thinking is. Okay. So that's where the goal is, how to learn how to pre-think. So what I'm going to do is, again, I'm going to put you in the line of fire. I'm going to give you one argument, simple argument, no answer choice, is just pure argument. What you have to do is you have to figure out what is the author assuming while making his claim. Okay. Now I'm going to give you, it says 2 minutes over here. I'm going to give you 3 minutes, so you have ample time. So you read the argument slowly, you focus on visualization, and you put in what you think is your assumption. Okay. After those 3 minutes, I'm going to apply the pre-thinking approach to that argument, and you're going to really see how we stay focused while applying the pre-thinking approach. And then we're going to evaluate a couple of submissions if we have time. So this is your introduction to pre-thinking. With that, are you guys ready to dive into what into the world of pre-thinking? Yes, no? Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to remove broadcast results. I'm going to clear this poll because this is where you're going to be putting your answers in. Okay, let me clear all answers, remove broadcast results, and here is your argument. Okay, make sure you have a pen and paper. It usually helps you to distill your thoughts and organize them properly. And with that, guys, good luck. I'm going to mute myself for 3 minutes. Here is your argument. Okay, guys, you have 1 minute. You can type your answers, press enter. All right, I have the last 5 seconds, guys. 3, 2, and 1. I'm going to start broadcasting results so you guys can read others' responses. Okay. Um, I'd say I've it's a 3 categories of responses here. The first category, which is I'd say the closest to the correct answer, or think categories of responses where you're talking about the right things, and but you've not used the precise words in those. And when I say precise words, it's not, I'm not worried about perfect English. I don't care about that. But the way you've expressed changes the logic of what you're really saying. And some of and majority of you have talked about the reward system and the impact of it are around that. Some of you have actually restated, very similar to what happened in the prior argument, restated what's given in the argument overall. Okay, and others what have really said is they've given statements that are outside the scope of the argument, where they've brought in their own knowledge over here. Okay, so let's say how do we go about solving these questions and solving this question. Now, one of the other things that I've observed when I look at these answer choices here is that many of you have recognized that this is a causal argument and have applied what is called as the classical causal formula to this, that you may have read either in the Manhattan book or in the Power Score book or so. Am I correct? Many of you have done that. You kind of recognize this as a causal argument, and you applied the classical formula for that's given in one of these books, because I can really see some of that language in your answer choices as well. Am I correct? Again, yes, no, come on. And there's nothing wrong in it. The thing that I want to tell you is those formulas work when it comes to medium questions. They do a really good job. When the question and the arguments become a bit more complex, what they yield versus what the answer choice is there is something that there's a mismatch over here. Complex questions take the same causal argument and phrase the answer choices very differently. And if you have a formulaic approach, you often miss those answer choices. So don't take a formulaic approach to critical reasoning is something that I would say. Why? Because it's a test of logic, not just a formulaic approach. So let's kind of look at how we're going to go about doing this. The first step we're going to figure out is understand the conclusion. So we're going to figure out which statement is your conclusion, and we're going to visualize that conclusion, and that's what I call as understanding the conclusion. Then we'll look at author's logic, and we're going to look at how the author arrives at that conclusion, and then we will ask pre-thinking questions. So with that, I'm going to bring in a poll. This poll will have 4 answer choices, and this poll will say which statement is the conclusion. Now, this has 4 answer choices. There are going to be just about 3 statements here. So please ignore answer choice statement 4, because I use this poll for another question. But before that, what is the falsification method? So let's kind of understand what it is. Now, the falsification method is designed to get assumptions out before you look at answer choices, and it's built on the very definition of conclusion. What is your conclusion? The conclusion is that an assumption is what's an assumption? It's the definition of assumption. It's an unstated idea that must be true for the conclusion to be valid, which means that without the assumption, the conclusion, there are scenarios in which conclusion will break down. Or in other words, if you think about that entire roof with the essential pillar, and the essential pillar is actually put around those scenarios where the roof is going to cave in. Or in the same way, an assumption is built around those scenarios where the conclusion breaks down. So if you want to figure out assumptions, one of the best ways to pre-think assumptions is to ask this question: in what scenario does the conclusion break down? If you ask this question, the answer to that question will give you scenarios that will lead to assumptions, and we're going to see all of that. So that's the second statement that I want you to write down. The first statement was that definition of what an assumption is. The second statement is this falsification question. Under what circumstances, given the facts and the argument, will the conclusion break down? We're going to use this question again and again, regardless of the argument structure or anything that we consider. So write this down. Now let's apply this to this particular argument here, and I'm going to clear the prior poll as well. I'm going to divide this argument into 3 statements. Now I want you to tell me which statement, 1, 2, or 3, don't choose statement 4 because it doesn't exist, is your main conclusion. Which statement here is your main conclusion? Let's get about 50 responses. I have 30 responses, 48. Cool. I have about 65 to 70 responses. That's wonderful. I'm going to end the poll and I'm going to broadcast the results. What you see is 45% of you have chosen the correct answer, which is statement 2. That is our main conclusion. 30% of you have chosen statement 1 as the main conclusion, and another 25%, I think it's 25%, yes, have chosen statement 3 as the main conclusion. And let's kind of discuss that because that's really important. Main conclusion is something that the author wants you to believe in. And when you look at this argument, what the author wants you to believe in is statement number 2, which is, hey, the difference in the learning imparted is because of the reward system that's there for the professors. That's what the author wants you to believe in. A lot of people think that statement 1 is the main conclusion, and 30% of you thought statement 1 is the main conclusion because you see this word concludes and you consider that to be a marker. Again, a formulaic approach. Remember, in any argument, the main conclusion is by the author of the argument. In statement number 1, this conclusion is made by the paper, not by the author. The author actually uses this information to arrive at his conclusion. So in that way, it's a premise. Okay. For those of you who chose statement 1, do you understand why statement 1 is not your main conclusion? Because it's not said by the author. It's not what the author wants you to believe as or take away from the argument. What the author wants you to take away is what's causing the difference in the learning. Okay. Okay, so statement 2 is your main conclusion. Now, why is statement 3 not the main conclusion? Because 25% of you also chose statement 3, because statement 3 is written to make statement 2 more believable. Statement 3 is written to support, in other words, statement 2. It's not what the author wants you to take away. The takeaway is statement 2. Now, let's kind of focus on this takeaway. We're going to focus on this conclusion, and let's visualize this conclusion. And clearly is a conclusion marker. Yes, thank you for that. Clearly is a conclusion marker. And if you are an e-GMAT student, you'll see the conclusion markers in the premise and conclusion lessons over there. Now, let's visualize this conclusion. What the author is saying over here is, the author is not doubting the findings of the paper. What the author is building upon the findings and is saying the reason why professors do not as great a job as lecturers is part-time lecturers is because of the reward system for that's there for the professors. So he's saying the author is saying is let's blame that damn reward system that's instituted for professors. That's the reason that professors don't do as great a job in enhancing student learning. Okay. Again, the key thing over here is the author is not disputing the report's finding. He's just assigning that blame to that reward system. Okay, this is what we call as the next step, which is argument structure. Now, I want you to read statement 3, and again, tell me this. In statement 3, whose reward system is being talked about? In statement number 3 here. I'm going to remove broadcast results. Whose reward system are we talking about? Is it just tenured faculty, just lecturers, or both tenured faculty and lecturers, or neither one of them? 5. Let's get 50 responses again. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Let me end the poll. It's interesting how focus leads to good results. So 72% of you have said it's just tenure faculty, and you guys are absolutely correct. 23% of you are saying both of them, and you guys are not reading this statement correctly. Let's kind of read statement 3. The criterion for rewarding tenured faculty places a greater, this comparative word greater, emphasis on research than on teaching. Again, let's visualize this. What this is saying is, when it comes to tenured faculty, maybe there's a 70% emphasis on research and 30% on teaching, 60% on research and 40% on teaching. That's what this greater is doing. Statement 3 doesn't tell us anything about the reward system for full-time lecturers. For those of you who chose both tenured faculty and full-time lecturers, is that clear when you now look at this? It doesn't tell us anything about the reward system. The greater is that 60-40 or that 70-30 split, or you could call it 55-45. Whenever you see comparisons in critical reasoning, make sure you visualize, assign numbers to it. So 25% who said both, can you see why it's not both? There's no mention of full-time lecturers over there. 25% folks. Yes, no. One thing that I'll tell you guys is I call this a very low risk environment. Why? Because you're not being judged over here. This is not a test. You're here to learn. The best way to learn is to participate. Okay. All right. So let's kind of look at this argument structure. The argument structure says the first statement gives you the context. It really says, hey, it sets the stage for the argument, where it says that, hey, according to this paper, full-time lecturers don't enhance student tenured professors don't enhance student learning as much as full-time lecturers do. So if I were to visualize, I'll say, okay, if full-time lecturers go to 100, then maybe tenured professors go to a 60. Okay, then based on this, the second statement, the author puts the blame on the reward system for the professors, and then statement 3 says, hey, why should we? It explains what the reward system for professors is. It says there's a greater emphasis on research, maybe there's a 70% emphasis on research and 30% on teaching. So it's written to support your main conclusion. Okay, so let's kind of figure out what are the assumptions here, and we're going to use this one question again, which is, under what circumstances, given the facts and the argument, will the conclusion break down? Okay, we're going to take this generic form of question and we're going to translate this into this particular form. And I want you to take some time to read this. Under what circumstances would the reward system not be responsible for the difference in performance, given that full-time lecturers enhance student performance more than professors do? We are given that. This is fact number 1. And reward system for professors places a greater emphasis on research than on teaching. That's statement number 3. Given that these two are true, we can't change them. Under what circumstances can we not blame the reward system? Can you see how this translates to this statement here? Under what circumstances, given the facts and the argument, these are the facts and the argument over here, will the conclusion break down, which means the reward system not be responsible? That's your conclusion breakdown scenario. Can you see that? Yes, no? Okay, just remember this. Archana says, how can we apply the falsification to all answer choices? Archana, there are no answer choices here. It's still the argument. Would it not be time confusing and consuming and confusing? Wait for it. Wait for it, and you will get the answer. Okay, so let's kind of go. I'm going a bit slow, but we'll pace up over here. So let's look at this. Under what condition will the reward system not cause the difference between tenured and non-tenured, given that reward system places greater emphasis on research? Let's kind of figure out the scenarios. These are two possible scenarios. Okay, What if non-tenured faculty has the same emphasis on research? In that case, can you blame the reward system? If non-tenured faculty has the same reward system, can you blame the reward system? No, you can't blame the reward system. Then what happens to my conclusion? If you can't blame the reward system, what happens to my conclusion? It fails. It breaks down, right? Crumbles, yes. What if, okay, what if a majority of tenured professors, 80% of tenured professors don't act as per the reward system. They say, okay, there is a reward system. We don't care as per it. We don't worry about those rewards. What if they don't act as per the reward systems? Then can you blame the reward system? No. In either case, what happens to my conclusion? It breaks down. Okay. Now, if these are scenarios in which my conclusion shattered or it breaks down, then what are my assumptions? My assumptions are that these scenarios are not possible, which means non-tenured professors do not have an identical reward system, and most tenured professors care about that reward system. These are good assumptions, correct answer choices that would be there as part of this. Now let's kind of look back. I want you to take a look at this and see the process that we followed. There's nothing that's rocket science about it. We created a template of a falsification question. We filled that template in using the facts and the argument. And because we had done that visualization, the scenarios came to us. And from there, we got what possible assumptions are there. There are a couple of others that are possible. I'm not going to go there. But I want to make sure you understand the process, because if you understand the process, you're going to be able to answer each and every question correctly. If you do make a mistake, then you're going to be able to figure out where you made a mistake. Is it in visualizing the conclusion? Is it in visualizing the answer choice? Is it in doing pre-thinking? And once you figure out where you or why you made a mistake, fixing that mistake becomes fairly simple. Okay. Now, for those of you who use the earlier formulaic approach, can you see that using the formulaic approach, you won't be able to get to these assumptions? It's going to be very difficult to get to these assumptions using that formulaic approach. No X, no Y, right? And as questions get difficult, those formulaic answers would not be there in the answer choices. It would be such visualized answers that would be there. Okay. So with that, let's kind of talk about timing. How many of you are thinking, man, this seems to be very long. This seems to take a lot longer than I thought it would be. How many of you are worried about timing and saying this is very long? Okay. So let me actually share some results with you. Okay. This is data from January till July 2021 of the number of 700 plus scores reported on GMAT Lab. You can go to the review portal, you can actually count these numbers. Okay. If our students have reported these many scores, then we must be doing something right, correct? No, this is verbal and quant. In fact, with Quant 2.0, we've delivered twice as many Q49 or higher scores than TTP has. So Princeton is not, I don't know who cares about Princeton in the GMAT prep space, frankly. No one cares about Princeton. They were a partner on GMAT Club, but yeah. Yes. I don't know why you would mention Princeton in the GMAT prep space as well. But again, just to really tell you, and this doesn't include August data. If we add August data, just in August, that number today would be 41. Okay. And a majority of these are just reported. The actual number of 700 plus scores is about 11 to 12x this. And the majority of these folks who needed help in critical reasoning talk about pre-thinking. Okay. So here is where's Magoosh? It's fewer than 5. Everyone else who's there is fewer than 5. There are about 13 partners here. Okay. Just for August, and you'll see those numbers come out very soon, our students have reported about 40 scores everyone else combined is about 20. And you'll see those numbers. So out of the 13 partners, our students have reported 40. The other 12 partners have reported 20 combined. So how will you feel as you go through this process? Okay, let's say you are a student who's starting at this point over here. Okay, step number 1, where your time to answer questions we'll get to the comparison later on, guys. Just hold on and let's kind of look at this. So let's say you start at point number 1 and where your time to answer questions is medium and your accuracy is low. And this number, depending on, there are about 140 students here, each one of you, this number would be different. But let's kind of assume that it's medium and low because it's a relative term. As soon as you start using pre-thinking, 2 things will happen. Your time to answer questions will go up. Your accuracy will go up as well. Most people, when this happens, they worry more about timing. They're not happy about accuracy. First of all, is that true? If that happens, you're going to be like this guy over here who's not going to be happy about his accuracy, who's going to worry about, man, this is taking longer. Okay. So this is going to happen. And especially for the next 10 questions that it takes. Why? Because you're learning the process. You've never visualized statements before. You're starting to visualize them. And because you're visualizing them, your accuracy is going up, but because your timing goes up, it creates that discouragement. Yes, it does. It will discourage a few of you. But many of you who have learned things the right way, who've mastered anything and who understand the process of learning will continue to do so. As you do so, 2 things will happen. Okay. Your accuracy will continue to improve. Why? Because that visualization piece, translating that falsification question into the context of that particular argument, that's going to become much more natural. And your time to answer questions is going to go actually below what we started with, while your accuracy will be super high. This is where you reach about what I call as that 70th percentile phase. And as you continue to do that, you're going to reach that 90th percentile phase. Okay. So that's something that you're going to really do. Okay. And it's not just from me. Don't worry about me. Look at the scores. Here's another this thing. If you go to a YouTube channel, you'll see 2 success stories posted every week. You will see about 180 fun video interviews over there. If you look at any other channel, you won't see more than 20. Okay. It needs more practice? No, it's not more practice. So 1 to 4 is about 35 arguments. So it's not a ton of practice. But for each question, you've got to spend 20 minutes. Which means you do this, you actually do pre-thinking and come up with an answer choice in about 3 to 4 minutes to begin with the first 10 questions. That's what it would be. But when you look at the solution, look at how an expert has done it, and that's where you're going to spend the other 15 minutes to really say, where did you falter? Why did it take you 3 to 4 minutes? Okay. Let's look at 2 other questions. For simple to medium questions, this makes a lot of sense to use this, but in some cases, there are R's. First of all, this is not R, so this is CR, but let's assume you said CR topics, which are in a completely new area which you're not exposed to. How can these scenarios be handled? That's a great question. So in true, if you've not been exposed to any scenario, for many people, they're not exposed to a scenario, for example, about beetles. And for them, pre-thinking is difficult over there. Those need to be a part of those 30 to 40 arguments for you to expose yourself to those scenarios, and that's where you need those 15 to 20 minutes to visualize it, and that's where you're learning that visualization. So for that, it's not going to happen, but once you do those 30 to 40 arguments, you'd be able to visualize this. Okay. What if you have a low score in verbal? Doesn't matter. Okay. So for those of you who understand who asked this question, why 20 minutes for each question early on? First of all, do you have your answer? A. And then the scenarios, unfamiliar scenarios, do you have that answer as well? Why 20 minutes and unfamiliar scenarios? Yes, no? Okay. And you're going to see this, you're going to experience this in the next 3 questions very soon. Understand the passage completely. Take your time. Equally important, pre-think. This one word will have the most impact. Here's a guy who actually scored 740, spent time on doing things. He skipped one RC, still got a 740. Okay. Here's another student who's studying at GSP Chicago. He says, answer CR questions as if there are no answer choices. Pre-thinking is a game changer. For this guy, he had a 700, a Q51, V34, CR. His CR ability was 37th percentile. He wasn't doing pre-thinking. We forced him to do pre-thinking. Within 20 days, his CR ability went from 37th percentile to 97th percentile or so. Okay. Why do you need to do pre-thinking? Because it helps you focus on the logic that the author uses, and it prevents you from deviating from key trap or out of scope answer choices on the argument. Okay. Here's another guy who scored a V44. For those of you who really said, weak student, this guy started with a 520. And when I give the PDF, all of these links would be clickable. Okay. This pre-thinking primes the mind when we are constantly on our toes while reading a paragraph or a CR question. So RC passage, when he says paragraph, it's RC passage. Pre-thinking also applies really well to RC passages. Apart from comprehending the passage, we keep speculating that in which direction the passage will orient or what logical jump has the author taken. Okay. So that's something. It is effort, and that's why. What's a 740 score? What percentile is a 740 score? Can anyone tell me? It's 97th percentile, which means if you're aiming for the 740 score, what you're really saying is, I want to be among the smartest top 3% of GMAT test takers worldwide. Okay. It doesn't come easy, I'll tell you that, which is why others don't have those scores. Okay. It requires that you grind it out, and you grind it out with the right process. If you don't do it with the right process, you'd just be grinding. It's the same way as if you have to break a tree, you can use that force with an axe, or you can just use the force. If you use the axe, most likely you'll cut the tree down. If you don't use an axe, you'll have a difficult time cutting the force down. Okay. The person who says it's easier to master when I was only preparing for verbal, when I was learning new concepts. When I moved to quant and back to verbal, I tend to forget. What you didn't do, my friend, is cementing. If you did cementing properly, you won't. That's where it is. Got to go through the cementing phase. Okay. Now with that, let's prove why pre-thinking works. I'm going to give you an example. This example seems very simple. The arguments are a very, very simple argument, but as you see the answer choices, you're going to find, if you don't apply pre-thinking, you're going to find, man, every answer choice seems correct. And you're going to have a difficult time isolating the answer choices. This is an official question. So apply pre-thinking, understand the conclusion, understand what must be true aspect of an assumption is as you go through it. Okay. Here is the question. I'm going to mute myself for 3 minutes, guys. Okay, guys, the time's up. Get those answers in. 3, 2, and 1. Let me just end the poll. Okay. So, how did this question feel? How did the question feel? Good, easy. Okay, it was easy. Little confusing. Okay. Was able to pre-think, not too difficult. Just to really tell you, for those of you who put in your responses, majority of you got it wrong. So with multiple assumptions which were in answers, there weren't multiple assumptions. Only one assumption was in the answer choices. So that's where I'm going to talk about the precision of pre-thinking. All right. So what's going on over here? Let's kind of look at this. Okay. So what's the claim that the highway commissioner is making? The question then says, what's the assumption on which the highway commissioner's claim depends? So what is this claim that this highway commissioner is making? Well, this is a 700 level question. So what's the claim that this commissioner is making? It's a deceptive 700 level question. The argument seems really simple. The answer choices mess it up. The claim that is making is increasing the toll will increase revenue by 50% or higher. That's the claim. Okay. So the author is simply asking, what is the assumption? So let's kind of look at this. Same process. What's the conclusion? It's over here. The conclusion's right over here. Annual revenue generated by the toll highway will increase by 50%. Now, this may seem really simple. Okay. And it is simple, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't visualize. So what this means is, when I say this, last year the annual revenue was $1 million. This year the annual revenue is going to be 1.5. Just always take numbers. If last year it was 10, then this year it's going to be $15 million. You've got to really, or 16 or 17, it could be anything, but it's at least 50% or so. Once you visualize this, it helps you kind of understand the logic a lot better. Okay. So how do we estimate annual revenue? What's the formula to estimate annual revenue in the context of this argument? What's the formula to estimate annual revenue? Why? Because the author is talking about annual revenue in the conclusion. Distance times cost per mile. Perfect. Right? Annual revenue is toll per mile multiplied by total number of toll miles. Very simple. Given in the argument, you can infer this from the argument over here. Why? Because it's given to us, it's 10 cents per mile. All right. Who says length of trip? Where do you see trip mentioned over here? Do you see trip mentioned in the argument anywhere? No. So where did you come up with trip? Do you see number of trips? Do you see drivers? No, nothing's there. What's given is 10 cents per mile. So the annual revenue is going to be toll per mile multiplied by the total number of toll miles. That's basically it. I mean, that's kind of how you would do. And the person who says 15 cents, that's correct. Why? Because we're increasing that by the toll is going to be 15 cents per mile and total number of kilometers. Or it's not miles, it's not kilometers, it's miles, but you got it. You kind of get the gist of it. Okay. So we're going to ask the same question. Why is the length of trip immaterial? You're going to see why it's immaterial. So let's ask the same question. If annual revenue is toll per mile multiplied by the total number of toll miles, and we know this is going to go up by 50%, we already know it's given to us as a fact. So in what scenario would annual revenue not go up by 50% provided that toll per mile has already been increased by 50%? In what scenario will that happen? In what scenario will annual revenue? The only scenario is if the number of toll miles decreases or the total distance decreases. Right? Very simple. You're focused just on the logic of the argument. Everyone with me? The only scenario is if the total number of toll miles decreases, which means that the assumption is this shouldn't happen. That's the only assumption that's possible. Everyone with me so far? Right? We've not looked at the answer choices. You now understand why pre-thinking is important, and we'll understand that. Okay, this is how you guys polled. Now let's look at answer choices. A lot of you chose choice B, which is an incorrect answer choice. Okay. So, choice B says the total number of trips made on the toll highway per year will not decrease from its current level. Now, if it does happen that if the number of trips decreases, does that mean the total number of miles traveled on toll roads will go down? Does that mean that? No. Why? Because let's say last year we had 1,000 trips. Now this year we have 900. Okay. Does this mean that the total number of toll miles driven on the toll highway will go down? Does that mean that? Does that automatically imply? No. Why? Because despite fewer trips, number of miles per trip could go up. Right? For those of you who chose choice B, can you see that? Okay. So then is this a must be true answer choice? Is choice B a must be true answer choice? Is it required for the conclusion to hold true? No, it is not a must be true answer choice. Okay. Which is why choice B is wrong. Okay. Let's look at choice C, which is my correct answer. The total distance traveled by vehicles on the toll highway will not decrease from its current level. Okay. Does that mean that the total number of toll miles will go down? Yes, toll miles is distance, right? Because if the total distance goes down, then that would be the case. Yes, choice B, if you were given that one entry and one exit, then yes. Okay, but you're not given that. Okay, which is, so coming back to choice C, you can see why this is a must be true. Why? Because if total distance decreases, this number goes down, and so despite a 50% increase over here, you will not have a 50% increase over here. So this is a must be true. Total distance should not go down. Okay. This is a classic case. Trip will affect the miles traveled? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Why? Because if you have fewer trips, the number of miles per trip can go up. Think about it this way. Let's say you're comparing two individuals, right? One guy owns 10 properties, which is, real estate properties. The other guy owns 15 real estate properties. Can you say with 100% certainty that the guy who owns 15 properties has a higher net worth just from real estate than the guy who owns 10 properties? Can you say that? No. Why? Why can't you say? Why? Because the cost per property is a major factor, right? What's the average cost per property that each one of them is holding? In the same way, when the number of trips go down, can you really say the total distance is going to go down? Not really. The length of trip is another factor. So then, is the number of trips a must be true? No. This is a classical example to show how assumption questions mess people up. They understand the argument, but they don't do pre-thinking. They don't follow the process, and they get in the answer choices. It messes them up. Choice B, excellent strengthener, not a proper assumption. It's a premise, or you can say it's a missing premise because it's not stated in the argument, but it's not a must be true condition. Similarly, choice C is wrong for the same reason, right? What happens if the average length of trip goes down? If the average length of trip decreases, what could compensate? What could compensate for the average length of trip? The number of trips. Choices B and C are complementary. The number of drivers you constantly avoid. Same logic, and use, if that increases from its current level, the current set of drivers could take more trips or could take longer trips. Okay. So you only need to think about the argument as a question. Yes, the critical reasoning is about the argument only. The answer choices are options given to you, and you have to choose one amongst those answer choices. But the information that's given to you is provided just in the argument. So you only have to worry about the argument. Can we get an idea of pre-thinking from answers? What did I say as the first statement when I was describing pre-thinking? What did I say? Once you start reading the answers, you can throw pre-thinking out of the window. Why? Because each answer choice will provide new information that will pollute the pristine argument. It'll add to the information that's given to you, and that will pollute your mind. So one of the biggest things you have to do is restrain yourself from doing pre-thinking, from looking at the answer choices if you're going to follow pre-thinking. Does that answer your question? Don't look at the answer choices. If you start looking at the answer choices, trust me, you are not going to be able to pre-think. A can also be, why can A be? Why is A wrong? Do we even care about the amount of money needed for road repairs? Does this have anything to do with commissioner's claim? The amount of money needed for road repairs, does it have anything to do with what the commissioner is claiming? What is the commissioner's claim? Revenue will increase. Okay, questions, Q&A pod. Toll highways don't have a measure so the person who says toll highways don't have a means to control the distance? Who says that? Okay, what's the commissioner's claim? What's the commissioner's claim here? Is the commissioner claiming, just a yes, no, is the commissioner claiming I'm going to provide enough revenue to finance road repairs? Do you see that anywhere? No. As a commissioner, I'm not claiming I'm going to give you enough money to finance road repairs. So why do you even care about? The question says, in order to, with the purpose to finance road repairs. There is nowhere in the argument that we are saying that we'll generate enough money to finance road repairs. All as a commissioner I'm claiming is that the toll increase will increase the annual revenue of the highway by at least 50%. That's it. If your expenses increase, that's your problem, not my problem. My claim is that the revenue will go up by 50%. Okay? Just remember what the conclusion is about. Anyone who was concerned about choice A, is that clear? The commissioners, the question says, what's an assumption on which the commissioner's claim depends? The claim is about revenue generated. It has nothing to do with getting enough money to finance road repairs. In the same way, we promise you, or we rarely say we're going to help you get a higher GMAT score. We don't really say you'll get into Harvard. Okay? All right. We will tell you in order to get into Harvard, you need a minimum of 730. But if you get a 740 and not get into Harvard, that is not our problem because your profile also plays a part. Okay, with that, let's kind of go into the highest gear. We will be solving to completely meet the current finance charges. Okay, let's kind of go back over here. What is the claim that the commissioner is making? What's the claim? Is he saying in the claim that the annual revenue will completely meet? If that were a part of the conclusion here, then you would start to make A as a thing. But if it's not a part of the conclusion, you can say it anywhere else. It doesn't matter. If you make it a part of the conclusion, yes. Think about it this way, right? Anyone over here who's a coder, who does any sort of programming or building a system for a living? Okay, so let's say your goal is to build a system, and let's kind of take a very simple system. Let's take your goal is to build a system that that is a memory which allows you to read 1,000,000 bits a second. Simple, a memory that allows you to read 1,000,000 bits a second. And you really say, to build that system, I need an IO unit that can process 10 million bits a second. And your claim is, using this architecture, I'm going to build an IO unit that processes. Your claim is, again, using this architecture, I'm going to build an IO unit, input-output unit, that can process 10 million bits a second. Now you build that IO unit and it can process 10 million bits a second, but still the entire system cannot read 1,000,000 bits a second. Should you be blamed? Haven't you done your job by building that IO unit that you promised? Should you be blamed to really say, hey, you built a bad IO unit? No, you've given your performance. If the entire system doesn't work, that's their problem. Your claim was purely on that IO unit, and that's the part of the claim that you made. And if your manager blames you for the failure of the entire project when your claim was just that, then please quit that job is what I would advise. Okay, now fourth and fifth question. Two very, very difficult questions. And so what I want to do is, I don't want to time you guys over here because these are super difficult questions. The process that we will follow is that I want you to click on this thing called not answered. And when about 70 to 80% of you choose an answer choice other than not answered, then I'm going to call time. So I want about 50 of you to click not answered. And this is a process that we're going to follow tomorrow in the number properties webinar as well, because we solve about 15 questions tomorrow. So 50 people say not answered, and then I'm going to show the question. Okay, 43. Let's get another 49, 50. Okay, I'm going to remove broadcast results, and here is the question. Good luck, guys. This is a difficult question. Take 3-4 minutes. All right, guys, about 60% of the class is done. Put those answers in. I'm going to give you another 30 seconds. Five, four, three, two, and one. Let me end the poll. I'm going to broadcast the results. This is how you guys polled. Choice A was popular, choice B was popular, choice D for delta was popular, as was choice C. The only choice that wasn't popular was E for elephant. And you can see about 12% of you didn't answer. Now I'm going to put in the next question. Again, the same process, and we're going to discuss both these questions together. Let me just clear the prior answers over here. Again, same process. I want you to select not answered. I want 50 people to say not answered before I show the question. That allows me to just moderate the poll, time it much better, because these are difficult questions. Good. Let me remove broadcast results. And here is your next question. Good luck, guys. All right, guys, another 20 seconds. Get those answers in. My timer says we are almost done, but 80% of you are done also. So 3, 2, and 1. Okay, let me end the poll. I'm going to broadcast the results. This is how you guys did. So it's how were these questions? Let me clear all answers. How did you feel after going through these questions? They were hard. They're difficult questions. I mean, the average accuracy here is about 20%, 25 to 30% or so. Yes, the RDS technology question was much harder. They were time consuming. Okay, but here's the fun with difficult questions. When you solve difficult questions, you actually get a lot of learnings, and those learnings help you solve many more easy questions correctly. Okay, so yes, this one was harder. It's probably the hardest official question. This is not an e-GMAT question. This is an official question, as is the next one. So let's kind of look at this over here and see how we go about doing this. These are two questions that are also of context that many of you may not be aware of. So these may be confusing context, especially given the fact that your generation is not the radio generation technically, at least not the radio in this sense that's given to you. So let's kind of look at this, and finding the conclusion is very easy. So the conclusion says the number of Verlanders, so let's call them V, Wordlanders. V's that receiving special program information probably did not increase significantly in this time period. So there are three things to worry about, or to just focus on this conclusion. First of all, it's using a comparative term. It's kind of comparing 1994 and 1996, and it's really saying the number of Verlanders did not increase during that time. So let's say what it's saying is if there are 1 million Verlanders in V's, let's call them V's, in 1994, then they probably were receiving the special program information. Then in 96, that number more or less remains 1 million or so. It can probably go up by 10, 15,000, but it is around that as well. That's kind of what it is. If there were 10 million in 94, it'll be 10 million in 96, more or less. The other thing to focus on this is that we are talking just about this one thing over here, special program information. That's all, or let's call them RDS programs, if it's simple. Okay, we are not concerned about anything else. The conclusion, as was the previous question where the claim was purely about increasing revenue, not to meet road repairs. Here the claim that the author is making is just about the special program information. Read this conclusion once again and tell me if you can observe these things here. It's between the delta between 94 and 96. It's about Verlanders, not people from outside. It's only about the number of Verlanders receiving special program information. Can you see that? Okay, more yeses? Yes. Let's move forward here. So let's kind of do the argument structure. Because we've done this, I'm going to kind of do this slightly more quickly. So what's going on over here? The main conclusion, this is the main conclusion, we've already discussed this. Now, why does the author make this statement? He says the number of RDS equipped radios remain the same. So these are radios that people have in their houses that remain the same in 94 as in 96. The number of transmitting stations, actually that number more than doubled. It went from 250 to 600. And the reason why you see a however over here is because statement number 2 and statement number 3 have actually opposite effects. If you see the number of transmitting stations go up, you'd see the number of people go up. But if you see the number of radio stations remaining the same, radios that people have remaining the same, then you won't see that number go up. And because these two statements are connected by however, you can really kind of infer that they will have an opposite impact on the conclusion. Statement number 3 is a supporting statement. Why? Because if the number of radios remain the same, it just makes the conclusion more believable that the number of Verlanders should remain the same. Statement number 2 seems to go against the conclusion. Why? Because if the number of transmitting stations has gone up, then of course more people should receive this. Also, you see the connectors over here, or the keywords over here that's connecting these two statements. Okay, Statement number 1 gives me context. It says that, hey, if I want to get the special program information, I need RDS technology both at the radio station as well as at the radio which is there in my house. I need a mated pair. I need RDS technology at both ends. The argument's clear? Is the argument clear so far? Okay. So let's kind of do the argument structure. Conclusion over here, between 94 and 96, very few additional Verlanders received this special program information. What happened between 94 and 96? Number of radios which people have in their houses remained unchanged. The number of radio stations went up quite a bit. And the context says, to receive this RDS programming that my conclusion is concerned with, you need to have RDS radio and you need to be around an RDS station. Just very, very simple stuff. Does the argument look a lot more simple now than what it did earlier? Okay, that's all that the argument is saying. Same process here. Under what conditions will there be a significant addition? Why are we doing a significant addition to the number of people receiving RDS programming? Why did we choose the term significant addition? In the falsification question, this is the falsification question. Because we want to break the conclusion, it's the opposite of the conclusion. Yes. Under what conditions will there be a significant addition to the number of people receiving RDS programming? We call this special program information. I just call it RDS programming. It's much simpler to say. Despite very few additional radios, because the number of radios have remained the same, but a lot more transmitting stations. So now tell me some scenarios in which you could have many more people receiving RDS programming given these constraints. What are some of the scenarios? More coverage, yes, if these new stations start to cover people who had the radio but had no coverage. Okay. And more people share their radios. Yes, people per radio go up. More people in the home with radios. Yes. Two possible scenarios you guys came up with. One is if the additional stations now cover areas where there was no coverage earlier, but people did have the right kind of radio. If you have a 5G cell phone but you have no 5G coverage, but then 2 years from now you have 5G coverage comes in, then the number of people who can make use of 5G will go up. Okay, this is the same logic, right? And if you start putting these radios in Starbucks and some people per radio go up, then also you'll get this. Now new radios aren't required. No, you're given that constraint. You need the mated pair. Please don't go outside the constraints given. Okay, so can you see these possible scenarios that will break your conclusion down? Can you see that? Both these scenarios will break the conclusion down. So, two good assumptions. New station should not increase my coverage. People per radio would remain about the same. You guys came up with it. I did not. Now, if you did this methodically, is that difficult to do? Is there any rocket science to it? No, there isn't. I've just translated what was given in an organized format and I've done this, and there's no rocket science to doing this pre-thinking here. It's about being methodical. Okay, so let's now do the answer choice analysis. I'm going to show you how you guys did over here. Let me bring the poll back so that if you forgot which statement you chose, you guys should be able to see the one marked against your the answer choice that you chose should be marked over here. It should be highlighted. Okay, so in this one, choice A for apple, A for alpha is the correct answer. 19% of you chose choice A. Let's kind of look at this. We're going to discuss every answer choice. So if you chose choice B, choice C, or choice D, hold your horses. We're going to discuss that. We're going to prove why that's wrong. Choice A is the correct answer. What choice A says is few, if any, of the RDS radio stations that began broadcasting after 94. Okay. Few, if any, the translation of that is almost none. of the RDS radio stations that began broadcasting after 94. In the context of the argument, what kind of radio stations are those? These are the new radio stations that have been added. Broadcast to people with the RDS equipped radios, which means I have the right kind of radio, living in areas not previously reached. What does this mean? Increase the coverage. Okay. So what this answer choice is saying is almost none of the radio stations increase the coverage of RDS programming, which kind of is the same as this assumption. Okay. Can you see this translation? Okay. When I said visualize the answer choice, this is what I meant. This is visualizing the answer choices. Those of you who did the pre-thinking right, yet got this wrong because you couldn't visualize the answer choice. If RDS coverage is not here, why will people purchase RDS radio in the first place? How many of you have an iPhone 12 here? How many of you have an iPhone 12? At least one person? Or a phone, or a Samsung phone, or any phone. I mean, every Samsung phone, every OnePlus supports 5G, right? How many of you have a 5G phone? Let's kind of put it this way. How many of you have a phone that supports 5G? Okay. Why do you have it? Most places don't have 5G. Yes. So why would people purchase a radio? Here is why people would purchase a radio. Does that answer your question? Okay. So, this is my correct answer. Negated statement breaks the conclusion. At least some radio stations increase coverage. Almost none. The negation of that is at least some. It increases coverage. Conclusion breaks down. There's no evidence mentioned that the RDS radio can also cover normal radio. Yes. Let me just explain the argument once again over here. Radio stations with RDS technology broadcast special program information that only radios with RDS feature can receive. What does this mean? Is this a radio? The stuff with RDS technology, is this a radio? Right? So, has anyone heard of Tesla? Yes. What do they do? What do they primarily do? Let's call it this way. Not Nikola Tesla, but they make cars, right? Do they have to tell you that those cars need to have 4 wheels? No. This is a radio. It will receive programming, man. It's just saying this is a special kind of radio that has a special feature, but they don't have to really tell you that, hey, it does the normal job. And if they say it's a radio, it does the normal job. That's common sense, right? When Tesla says, I'm going to sell a car, you're going to assume it's going to take you from point A to point B. It will have some sort of wheels there. Okay. Let's look at choice B. Any doubts on choice A? How it applies to the logic of the argument? Okay, let's look at choice B. Now, before I explain choice B, what's the definition of an assumption? What is the definition of an assumption? I asked you guys to write this down early in the session. It's an unstated idea, yes, that must be true for the conclusion to hold true. Unstated must be true. 2 points. Good. Right? Everyone remembers this now? Unstated must be true. Right? A good answer choice needs to satisfy both these conditions. Now, let's now look at choice B over here. Okay. Choice B says in 1996, most worldlanders or most Vs who lived within the listening area of an RDS station already had a radio equipped to receive RDS. Okay. What is my conclusion? My conclusion is between 94 and 96, the number of overlanders, sorry, my 9 was messed up, to 96, the number of overlanders receiving the special program information did not change a whole lot. You guys remember the conclusion? If there were 1 million people, okay, guys, questions in the Q&A pod. This right-hand pod is for my questions to you, not for your questions to me. Okay, let's go back. What's the conclusion of this argument? If you put the question in the Q&A bot, that's why Harsha is here. Okay, and he's a better instructor than I am. All right. So what's the conclusion here? In this argument, what is the conclusion? If there were 1 million people in 94, there were a 1 million people who were receiving special programming information in 96. Everyone agrees with that conclusion? Right? Now, let's look at this answer choice. What this answer choice says is, in 1996, most Worldlanders who lived within the listening area already had a radio equipped to receive RDS. Let's translate that most into 60%. Okay, it could. Now tell me one thing. Is it required that 60% of Worldlanders have an RDS radio for my conclusion to hold true? Can my conclusion not hold true if 20% had an RDS radio in 94 and the same 20% had an RDS radio in 96? It can, right? So that most is not required. Okay. Or in other words, the conclusion is about the change in number between 94 and 96. You don't need to have any absolute piece in 94 or 96 at all. People who chose choice B, is that clear? Okay. Let's look at this. Equipping a radio station with RDS technology does not decrease the station's listening area. What kind of programming are we worried about in the conclusion? What kind of programming are we worried about? RDS programming. If a radio station does not have RDS technology, can it transmit RDS programming? If a radio station does not have, no. So what's the range of RDS programming of that radio station if it does not have RDS technology? 0, right? Zero. So when it says equipping a radio station with RDS technology does not decrease a station's listening area, what kind of programming is this talking about? Is it RDS or non-RDS? It's non-RDS, right? And we don't care about that. It's just talking about the wrong thing. Which is what choice D does too. Let's look at choice D. In 1996, Worldlanders who did not own radios equipped to receive RDS, which is kind of the wrong kind of radios, could not receive any programming, wrong kind of programming, from the RDS radio stations that began broadcasting after 94. A lot of people don't understand this answer choice. Some people really say, hey, this has the word any, and I have been told by some experts, any generally is the correct answer because it's a very broad term. And let me choose that. Okay, why is it wrong? We don't care about people who don't have the right radio, and we don't care about any programming. We only care about RDS programming. People who chose choice D, even if you focus just on the conclusion, you should have been able to reject choice D. Because the conclusion talks about RDS programming people, the conclusion talks about the change in number between 94 and 96. This talks about the absolute number in 96. This talks about people who don't have the right kind of radio. One of the easiest answer choices to reject if you translated and visualize this answer choice. Wouldn't that apply to people who don't have RDS but share one? When you look at the essence of this, that's a great question, by the way. That's a great question. Okay. The question is, would this apply to people who don't have RDS radios but are listening to this in Starbucks? Okay, that's a great question. And who said that? Because it's a legitimate doubt. Okay, A said that. And again, I wish you had put in your proper name, but that's a great question. Now, the word receive is being used here, not listen to. And this is where words have that play. Receive means I'm getting it on my radio. Got it? The essence of this is on their own devices. Again, can I please showcase the previous slide? Okay, here is the previous slide. You can read that. And again, you will have the recording. I'll give you the PDF. So you can read that. Couldn't people have new devices that can listen to RDS? Another good question. Let's see if I have my argument over here. I want to just get the argument properly. Let's get to the argument. What's given to you in the context? What's given to receive RDS programming, you need RDS and radio stations, right? You cannot go outside the scope of the argument. You can't. Why? Because GMAT critical reasoning is a test of logic, not a test of imagination. And if a constraint's given to you, you've got to follow that. No, it's not LOL. I mean, you know, as normal people, I don't discourage imagination, right? And if you think about visualization, you can say it's imagination, but it's imagination within the context, right? So, and it's a really important question. You have to understand what context is being given to you. And think about it this way: the GMAT critical reasoning, probably the best way to build a manager skill. If you've been asked to think within a certain constraint, if you go outside that constraint, think of it. Your boss really says you have to think within a certain constraint. You go outside that constraint, your boss is not going to be really happy. Okay, so because there's a reason why your boss gave you a constraint. That's why that's there. The same way, there's a reason why an argument gave you a constraint. Okay, don't go outside the argument. Okay, choice E, no one chose that, so I'm not going to worry about choice E. Let's go to choice, the next question. But before that, what did you learn? Very difficult question. Was the logic difficult, guys? Once you understood the argument? Was that rocket science? No, it wasn't, right? It was a sophisticated argument. It had many entities in there, but if you remain organized, there is nothing that the test can throw at you that you can't solve. If you remain organized, if you have great solutions, if you have a great support system, this is not a difficult test. But the reason why people falter on the GMAT, not just critical reasoning, is people try and go towards trick, people worry about timing. How many of you think the GMAT's a test of timing? And I'm going to get to this question. How many of you think that? Why do you think that? Why do you think the GMAT's a test of timing? No, why do you think that? There's a timer, yes. It's a constraint, yes. Time management has an impact, but it's not a test of timing. The GMAT, any expert who tells you the GMAT's a test of timing doesn't understand the test. The GMAT is a test of ability. All questions have to be answered? Not really. You know, you answer the first 27 questions out of 36 questions and randomly mark the other ones, I can guarantee you will get a V40. So no, all questions don't need to be answered. Okay. Yes. Tell me one thing. In the business school or in an actual life, what are you paid to do? Are you paid to make good decisions or are you paid to make super fast decisions? Good decisions. The same way the GMAT needs to be a test of good decision making. Now you have to make those decisions in an appropriate amount of time, but it is not primarily a test of timing. Frankly, if you have the ability and if you have good decision making within the test, you won't find timing to be an issue. Who says good decision in super fast time? No. In a reasonable amount of time. You can't make good decisions in super fast time. Most decisions made in super fast time don't look at all the constraints. All questions need not be answered explained. The beauty of the GMAT, it's a computer adaptive test, which means if you go in the high ability zone, people who score a V40 actually get about 30% of all 700 level questions wrong. Okay, regardless of how you do it. Or actually even the V44, which is 98th percentile. So if you think the GMAT's a test of timing, I'd say take all the time for the first 27 questions and randomly, and you get those 27 questions right, you can randomly mark the remaining questions and you'll still get a V40. There's a penalty to leave questions unanswered or have too many answers incorrect correctly. No, not really. There is a penalty to leave questions unanswered. Yes, I'm not asking you to do that. But if you prove to the test, and wherever you've read, let me just say this, no one has done half as much research as we have done on the GMAT, which is why we started giving people personalized study plans about in 2018. So by profession, I'm actually an algorithm designer. The phones that you hold in your hand, I designed most of the physical layer, which is the radio part of it, about 15 years back. So yeah, at Nokia, yes. I was a researcher for Nokia. So all right. Let's go to this last question. Okay. This is a beautiful question, and the reason why it's a beautiful question, yeah, my first board for a 3G phone and then a 4G phone. The first 3G phone board was for those of you who've taken mechanical drawing, it was bigger than your mechanical drawing board. Okay, so let's kind of go about doing this. So let's kind of take visualization to that next level here. Now, in this case, what's going on? You know, last year we actually burned everything. So I couldn't get a really good icon for a truck, but I could get an icon for a trash can. So let's assume a trash can is a truck. So last year, how many trucks were incinerated if you can count the number of trash cans in this picture here? On the slide, 10 were incinerated. We did not recycle anything, we incinerated 10. Now this year, what are we going to do? How many trash cans are we going to send for incineration? We're going to send 5, half of what it was last year. Now my question to you is, and this is, I'm going to put in a poll question here. And this question is, how many trucks will be sent for incineration this year? Now, if instead of collecting the same amount of refuse, if I collect 10 times as much refuse, if I collect 10x as much refuse, how many trucks do you think will send for incineration? If last year we collected this much refuse, this year we collect 10 times as much. How many trucks do you think are we going to send for incineration this year? Last year we sent 10 trucks. Three. Come on, guys, get the answer. This is a simple question. You've done this. 2 and 1. The question is, if I collect 10x as much refuse, how many trucks will I get sent this year? Is it 5, 10, 25, 50, or 100? Simple question. Okay, and the poll, let me broadcast results. The correct answer is 5. Only 22% of you got this right. And this is kind of what shows understanding the logic of the argument. Let me explain why it's 5 despite collecting 10x as much refuse. Let's look at the last statement. This year, city services will separate for recycling enough refuse to reduce, to mean it's a purpose word, the number of truckloads to be incinerated to half of last year's number. What it's saying is, regardless of how much garbage you collect, I'm only going to send half as many trucks as we sent last year. Yes, I said last year we sent 10 trucks. What does the statement say? How many are we going to send this year? Half of what it was last year, regardless of how much refuse we collect. Can you guys see that? This is a fact that's given to you. What this sentence is saying is, regardless of the amount of refuse, I'm only going to send half as many truckloads. Not 50 recycle, 95 recycle or 95 elsewhere and 5 incineration. Not 50, just 5. Even if I collect 100 truckloads worth of refuse. And that's the beauty of reading and visualization. You've got to do this. Okay, so I think you guys understand this right now fairly well. So we're going to go towards the falsification question. The conclusion is the ash generated this year will be 50% of what was generated last year. Okay, we go through the same process. We say, under what conditions will the ash generated be greater than 50%? My falsification question, if I'm only going to send half as many trucks for incineration. What's the only condition in which the ash generated will be greater than 50% even if I only get 5 trucks? What's the only condition? If I get more ash per truck, yes. The only condition is more ash per truck. Okay. So what's my assumption? I don't get more ash per truck, or in other words, the ash per truck is similar to or lower than what it was last year. Again, the same process. But as I said, before pre-thinking, you've got to visualize. This is how you guys did. Only 37% of you chose choice D, or 35% of you chose choice D. So you can see how many of you chose choice C, chose choice E, even chose choice A. Okay. So the good thing about this is, if you did the pre-thinking and 50% of total, okay, then you now know where you need to improve and now how not to make that mistake. Let's look at, so choice D is the correct one. Choice A. Choice A is a very rare kind of answer choice, which is where this is a must be true answer choice. It satisfies the must be true condition, which means that, hey, no materials that you're separating for recycling, you're not going to burn those materials. It is a must be true. But the problem is it's already given in the argument. You can infer this from the argument that whatever is separated for incineration for recycling will not be incinerated. So it doesn't provide any new information. It doesn't satisfy the first tenet of an assumption, which means that you shouldn't be able to infer that information from the argument, which is why this is wrong. Choice B is about cost. We're not going to worry about that. Choice C then talks about the proportion of recyclable materials. We don't care. Why? Because we're only going to get half as many truckloads. So we don't care about this. Choice D is our correct answer. You can see the negation. If anyone has a doubt on this, you can ask. I'll be happy to actually explain that. Choice E talks about the total quantity of refuse. Very popular incorrect answer choice, and I've explained why that is wrong. It doesn't matter. I'm only going to get half as many truckloads. So, with that, what have you learned? What have you learned so far? Pre-think is key. What else? What else is key? Pre-think is super important. Yes. You need to follow the process correctly. Again, remember, pre-thinking is not predicting the answer. You have to come up with one correct assumption. Sit back, yes, learn the falsification method, but also equally important is visualizing. Do not rush through things. Okay. Okay. Let's go back to choice C here. Larger proportion. Did they separate for recycling a larger proportion of recyclable materials than it did last year? First of all, what was the proportion that it did last year? What was the proportion that it did last year? You don't know that. It sent everything for incineration. No, it didn't recycle anything. You don't know what it separated. It did not recycle anything. Separation is something which was there. It's not specified. Okay. The second thing is, what are you given? You're only going to get 5 trucks. What about option B? What in option B is relevant to you? What about this is relevant to my conclusion? It's a cost. Do we care about cost? Do we care about cost? No. Option E is what we discussed in the scenario. The total quantity of refuse doesn't matter. Right? Does it matter? Because I'm only going to send half as many truckloads. So, if you're still confused between option C, then you have to focus on what the conclusion is about. What is the conclusion about? What is the conclusion about? In this case, what is the conclusion about? Let me ask this. Residual ash. No, we're not burning less, but residual ash, right? How do you generate ash? By burning. How do you generate ash? By incineration or burning, right? So what should you care about? What is being burnt? Do you care about what happens to recyclable material? Is it whether it's recycled or whether it's put in a landfill? No. What you care about is incineration. Okay, and what have you been told about incineration? That you're going to be sent half as many truckloads. That's what you've been told. You know, when I was in business school, we had this case study that we did as a part of, I think it's something that we did within the first 3 days of starting business school. And in this case study, and which is something you're going to always find in the business world also, that you will never have perfect information for everything, okay? But you'll have perfect information for chunks from which you'll be able to make decisions. So one of the cases that we had, it was about running a production line where you had imperfect information for the entirety of demand, and a lot of people who were like optimizers and engineers, especially Germans, they tried to optimize it in some way and they faltered. Why? Because they were trying to optimize everything. On the other hand, if you focused on stuff for which you had 100% information and you focused just on that, you got much better results. This is the same scenario. You don't know what's going to happen to stuff that's separated for recycling. What you know is whatever I burn, that generates ash. And that is all you need to focus on, because your conclusion is just about that. It's not about landfills. It's not about what gets recycled. It's about what gets burned. And that's where that focus on conclusion is really important. And that's where drawing that logical structure with it is really important. Do you guys get that? Okay. Guys, I'm going to give you the slides in about 5 minutes or so. Okay. So, takeaways. This is not rocket science. If you do this, you will cut through the clutter, you will achieve much higher accuracy, and you will get through answers much more quickly. Um, uh, uh, why? Because essentially you have a much better understanding of what's important in the context of the conclusion. Okay. Now, what should you be doing next? How do you get to that 90th percentile in critical reasoning? The thing that you've got to understand is getting to that 90th percentile is about conquering 4 different cosms. The first piece is organizing the argument, which means when you're given an argument, how do you organize the premises, the anti-premises, the contexts that are given to you, and in a logical fashion. You really saw as arguments became more complex, if we organize them properly, they were simplified. It's really, really important as a skill. The second thing is to understand and visualize the conclusion properly. Really, really, really important. If you don't understand the conclusion, you're going to mess up. In the professor's one, the tenured professor's question, many of you didn't visualize what the conclusion said. That messed you up. If you don't, the next thing that's really important is to do the pre-thinking. If you don't simplify stuff, if you don't do conclusion, you can't do pre-thinking right. So for those of you who've tried pre-thinking and have failed, people usually don't fail on this if they know the right process. People usually fail here or fail here, and because of this, they end up failing here. Okay. But this is required, which is why we say you only need about 15 seconds to do this. Why? Because you're going to take more time here. Okay. And then the last piece that's important is, to take that information further and visualize the answer choice in the context of the argument. In the RDS technology questions, as you were looking at choices C and D, you did not take the argument forward and or did not visualize the answer choice in its entirety, because of which, despite putting in the effort, you guys faltered. And you can really see each one of these independently leads to failure. But you need to build these skills right from here to here. And it's about thinking about this. So where does timing come in all of this? When you are in that learning phase, when I said, hey, you're going to take about 15 to 20 minutes per question early on. When you're in the learning phase, you are learning the skills to classify. For example, when you read an argument, it's not going to come naturally for you to organize that argument, and you may have to write things down to organize it. But once you do that for 10 questions, you're going to find you get much, much better at doing that. And a time will come at 10th or 11th or 15th argument, you'd say, I don't need to really formally organize it. I can organize it in my brain. But till you get to that point, formally organize the argument. Similarly, visualizing the conclusion is going to take you time. But within that same 10-15 arguments, you're going to start doing that naturally. Okay. And it's only when you do those things, that's when you can worry about pre-thinking overall. You need mastery on all grounds. Should we be this systematic from the first question, or should you apply this once the difficulty level increases? Right from the first question, OC. Otherwise, you're going to make mistakes on easier questions. You might not even see difficult questions. Okay, I'm going to now talk about 3 success stories. Okay, going forward, but you can see those on our website. But how do you achieve this mastery one step at a time? And if you're an e-GMAT student, this is what an account for a V44 student looks like. Okay, so this is what you're trying to achieve. This is a 3D chart. We've looked at hard questions. We've looked at last 20. You will not get there tomorrow or day after tomorrow, but in about 7 to 8 days, you will get there. This is what you're aiming for. How do you get to this point? Okay. If you are an e-GMAT student, build the right foundation. And you can see this is just learning how to classify statements and how to organize arguments. And you can see this is about 2.5 hours worth of effort. Of a person who scored a 780, this is high quality effort. What you really see is this evaluation done everywhere, and the person has scored 100% and has spent enough time. This is not the length of the video lesson. This is what the person or this particular individual spent. She actually scored a 780 on the GMAT. Okay. Now, how do you then create those logical structures for various kinds of arguments? This is where you go into this introduction to assumption, pre-thinking logical gap, and pre-thinking two entities. For a free trial student, these are parts of free trial. This gives you the next steps that you can do. Again, you can see every activity is evaluated. You get a score for it. It's based on your action. This is not completion percentage. This is your understanding percentage. You can see the amount of time it takes. Now, what does it take to achieve that 100%? This needs to be dedicated effort. I don't want you deviating from learning during that time. I don't want you tired when you're doing this. People who actually score in the 90th or the 95th percentile, they don't do different things. They do things differently. And this is that difference that I'm talking about. That focus that's there, and that leads to this precision in this case. If you are a paid student, this is what you need to do. This is just your pre-thinking for assumption piece. What you see over here is various argument structures that are put in. Logical gap, where you the second is where you compare two entities, where you compare segments within an entity, where you have both entities and segments comparison and quant-related arguments. Again, you can see how much time we spend on doing this. Then you have a set of application files, and you have a set of practice quizzes right here. When you go through this, you will have already gone through about 80 arguments. Remember, this is the learning phase, just in assumptions, not even in strengthen, weaken, evaluate, or bold phase. This is the rigor that you go through. And by the way, this is so interesting. You're gonna be able to do this in about 4 days. And you'll see that critical reasoning level go to that next point if you do this in a focused fashion. How comprehensive this is, I can tell you, the entire Manhattan book or pre-thinking or power score book, the entire book across does not have 80 arguments there. Okay. And through this, you're going to be able to cover each one of these steps in the context of assumption. Once you do that, then you go to evaluate, you apply the same thing. Then you go to strengthen, then you go to weaken, logically complete, and bold phase, and you reinforce those learnings because the fundamentals remain the same. Okay. So people have done this. Lots and lots of people have done this. In August, 66% of all people who reported 700 plus scores have done this. Okay, and you can watch these success stories on some of these success stories on our YouTube channel, which by the way is the world's largest collection of GMAT success stories. Anyway, whether you look at India, the US, Europe, or so. Okay. So here's a guy who went from 570 to 740, took him about 4 months, and he says, hey, someone who taught physics, very logical guy, he thought CR won't be a problem. But again, he faltered. Why? Because he wasn't used to reading and visualizing pieces over there. And what he said is just that extra 5 to 10 seconds. Once you get the right method, that's exactly what it would take. It helped him identify those traps and not fall in them. Okay, so start that pre-thinking journey, and you know, we talked about 4 days for assumptions, but the entire CR course is about 10 to 14 days. And this is studying 2 hours a day on weekdays and 4 hours a day on weekends. Okay, with that, you know, I want to thank you for being here. And at this point, we are at this open-ended Q&A part. Let me share the session PDF with you. And if you have any question, I'd be happy to answer those questions. OC says, can you buy only verbal? We don't let people buy only verbal, OC, because what happened was that when we had even verbal online, first of all, 90% of the people bought our GMAT online courses. And the other piece is people need mock tests. And when they needed strategy support, they didn't have the best version of Scholarinium with that. So what we have done is we've reduced the price for people who want just verbal only, and you can buy GMAT online 2 months. That way you get the best course. If you need help in quant during those 2 months, you do that. But then when you write to us for strategy advice, you know, our strategy experts are not really kind of saying, hey, you don't have the quant course from us, we can't really give you strategy advice. Why? Because our strategy experts are so well trained. When people get strategy advice on verbal, they do write to us on quant as well, and we felt really handicapped while doing that. So yeah, if you need just a verbal package, buy the GMAT Online Focused, and if you're looking for just verbal, you shouldn't need more than 2 months anyway. Is it so? Hopefully that answers your question. Yeah. Is it necessary to have a technical background to get into an MBA program? Absolutely not. No. I mean, again, we have another channel on our YouTube, another playlist on our YouTube channel, where we talk about how people got into top schools, and if you go there, you can really see the backgrounds of various folks who've gotten into top schools. Let me actually look at this over here and see if I can share that playlist with you. So, but no, absolutely not. What you should have done is you should have achieved. You should have a career where you've achieved something, and that's really important. Doesn't matter whether it's done in sales or marketing or anything else. So Pooja, here is the playlist. Do we have a webinar on RC or SC in the near future? Yes. I mean, we have a strategy webinar next week, but then we have a webinar on SC and RC also the week after. Is there any feedback inputs I can provide to people who want to do a PhD? Actually, yes. We have some students who've done that. Let me see if I can tell you. Let me just make sure. Write to me. I'm going to actually put you in touch with one of former students. He had done an interview with me on how do you get into a PhD program. I can recall his face, but I can't recall his name. So yeah, write to me. Okay, Srini. All right. Again, you can write to me at rajat@e-gmat.com. Wishy says, is it mandatory to get a 750 for Ivy schools if you have an experience from a top-notch MNC? I think the question that you're asking is, in my opinion, the wrong question. So is it mandatory? No, But 90% of Indians who I know of have a 740 or higher score. And so if you go and watch this success story, you're going to find as an example of a student who had a 710, had an excellent time in interviews, but could not get in. And when he reached out to schools, the schools told him that, hey, your GMAT score is not high enough. And so he actually prepared for the GMAT again, improved it to a 750, didn't even apply again, just updated that score. And Columbia, that rejected him, actually admitted him with a scholarship, just without even another application. Just as the difference was 710 to 750. Okay, so that's something that is there. So in my opinion, and based on the data that I've seen, and we go through about 10,000 students a year, I wouldn't apply to an Ivy League with a 710 if you are an Indian. If you are from Africa and if you have that compelling work experience, then yes. If you have, for example, worked in civil service and if you have a compelling work experience, then yes, but not otherwise. Okay, let's look at some of the other questions that I see. Entrepreneurship. What would I recommend? One thing that I would recommend that you take a look at is, I answered this question, what's the value of entrepreneurship MBA for someone who wants to be an entrepreneur? And the question that was posted to me was, how did an MBA help you build e-GMAT? I'm going to share the video. So the short answer is yes. If you want to be an entrepreneur, definitely go for an MBA. That's the short answer in that case. But here is a session that actually one of our former students from Columbia, she actually hosted a session, and yeah, So an MBA is a very worthwhile investment, Jason, is what I would say. And here is more details. Is it possible to revise the course effectively in 15 days? Shiva, I think the question is wrong to begin with, because frankly, revision needs to happen only for selective areas where you're naturally weak in. So is it possible to do that in 15 days? Actually, it's possible to do that in 10 days. And if you're working with one of our mentors, we tell people the revision strategies. But if you're really saying, I've got to revise the entire course, then, just if you're asking that question, that's an indication that you're not ready for the test. Okay. All right. Can you get an international scholarship if you apply in this round, second round and third round? Absolutely, Falguni. I mean, here's this misconception which people have, that hey, scholarships are only available in round one. No, that's not the case. They're available in round two. They're available in round three. I can tell you when I applied personally. So first of all, let me just add some context. In about 10 days, you're going to see this on our website. e-GMATers have gotten more than $200 million worth of scholarships. Okay. And so when I look at the split of those scholarships, I'd say about 90 odd million have been in round one, about 70 odd million have been in round two, and the remaining have been in round three. So yes. If you have a 710 in round one and a 740 or 750 in round two, you're probably 4 times as likely to get a scholarship and an admit in round two than in round one. Again, if you go to our YouTube channel, you can probably see about $5 odd million worth of scholarship. There are students' profiles and everything. Okay. Would you suggest someone who has a unique background in multiple languages with only 2 years of work but a high GMAT score to apply to top schools? Simran, again, there are 2 ways to look at a profile, and please don't come to me for profile advice, because I simply don't have the time. I have a lot of experience, that's what I'm telling you, but we help people with their GMAT, not with their MBA journeys, at least not yet. So the 2 ways to look at a profile. One is to say, hey, number of years, which institution you came from, and all of that piece. But the second is the achievements that you've had. How much have you progressed within an organization? And so if in 2 years you've shown that maturity, then 2 years in some instances is plenty. But if you've not shown that maturity, then 5 years isn't enough. So I think this is much more of a detailed profile evaluation case, and where first step is you have to really say, what have you achieved in those 2 years? So that's really important. Okay, let's look at other questions here. I don't have a location constraint, but I'm not aware of colleges I should be keeping an eye on. So Aishwarya, I think so how do you figure that out? First thing is figure out why do you want to do an MBA? Forget about colleges. Answer why you want to do an MBA. What do you want to do post your MBA? Once you answer that question, that creates your first filter. The second thing that you have to really look at is okay, where do you like to live? I understand you don't have a location constraint, but there may be places where you want to live. What is it that you want from that place? That gives you the second constraint. And then, look at what achievements have you had and which schools based on those achievements are in your reach category. And that's the third filter. But the first thing is why MBA? Forget about schools. Answer the why MBA question and then go to schools. Does the GMAT score requirement differ as per nationality for business schools? It absolutely does, Michelle or Michael. For example, the median score for M7B schools is essentially about 726, 727. If you look at the median score across nationalities. Now, we deal with a lot of international students, and just recently, and this is again, as I said, data that will be there on our website in about 10 days, we reached out to about 400 people, out of which about 80 went to M7 schools, and 80 were successfully admitted to M7 schools. Their median score was 742, which means that the median score for people who are who are from Canada or the US, who I would consider as more or less domestic, theirs is around that 714, 715 mark. So yes, the score requirements are different. If you're in India and you apply to Columbia, and if you have a 720, there's a very high chance they won't even look at your application. Why? Because in my discussions with the director of admissions, they really said, because we have enough candidates with higher GMAT scores. Why should we look at quality? Is not a problem for international students. So yes. Is it true that a good GMAT score most automatically guarantees a scholarship? Actually, no, it's not true. But here is how scholarships are granted. And let me actually take a sip of water. If that were true, imagine how we would sell our courses, right? I mean, I would really say, hey, I'll guarantee a certain score, give me a proportion of the scholarship money. But here is how GMAT scores are used. When a B school looks at you, they look at two things: your profile and your GMAT score. And they really say, what's your chance of how much I like you? That's the first question they answer. And what's the likelihood of you going to another business school? Okay, because given your profile over there and your GMAT score. So what a GMAT score does is it opens up doors for a bunch of business schools. Let's say you had a 690 and you had an excellent profile. You will most likely be applying to the likes of Keenan Flagler, Georgetown University, and so on and so forth because of your GMAT score. Stanford or Harvard, unless and until you truly had an exceptional profile, will not look at you because they get really good, I mean, people with 740 with really good profiles. The same person with a 750 or a 770 now starts looking at Harvard, Stanford, GSP, Chicago, Kellogg, and Columbia and Stern and Yale and a bunch of other schools. So if you apply with a 770 to these schools, Harvard will probably offer you a 40-45% scholarship. At the same time, Columbia will offer you a full ride, or a Kellogg will offer you a full ride because they want you. And for them, they say, okay, I understand he might be able to get into Harvard as well, but for me, the only way for me to get him is if I offer him a full ride. So does that help, Mohammed? So just a GMAT score doesn't do that, but a GMAT score with a good profile does that. Is it advisable for first-time test takers to prepare for only a month and don't know what your starting score is? I mean, we've had students who've done this in 3 weeks, but they were at a 680. But then we've had students who've taken 6 months who started at a 400. So it all depends on your starting score. And that's why we give everyone personalized study plans. Do we provide support for applications? We don't. This is very simple. We know a lot about it, probably more than most admission consultants do, but it's just we can't do justice to the volume of students that we serve. So, but we work with some of the best admission consultants. We actually have, next week, as I said, we have the Dean of MIT, who's not an admission consultant, but the following week we have Paul Bodine, who's actually the father of admission consulting. He's equivalent to Michael Porter when it comes to admission consulting. So what Michael Porter was in strategy, that's what he is in admission consulting. We have him on our platform. He and I would be talking about leadership. In a couple of weeks we have Prashant. Then we have had we usually have top admission consultants talk on our platform or so. So we work with them. We recommend good admission consultants, but we don't do that ourselves. No, we do one thing. We do it 10 times better than anyone else that's helping you as the GMAT. 711 years of work experience from PSU. What are my chances at IMD and judge? Don't know. This is not your profile. Your profile is what have you done at the PSU piece. Okay. How much does undergraduate GPA matter? Again, it's not a formula. If you have an excellent GMAT score, good profile, you can mitigate a low GPA. We've had students who've gone to Wharton despite low GPA. So let me just share this with you. Here is me interviewing one of our former students who got into Wharton, despite the fact that he had a low GPA, so he covered it up with other things. So there's no fixed weightage to it. Media and management, want to do an MBA. Which college should you apply? Look at Columbia. I think Columbia has a new degree in media and management. There are a couple of other colleges as well that have good degrees in media and management. Also look at Anderson. I mean, schools in LA will have that as well. Jaspreet says we are starting for a 600. How much time do you need to get to a 750? About 200 hours, Jaspreet, of effort. Now, whether you put it in a month or whether you take about 3 months to put it in, it's usually, I'd say, 2 to 2.5 months for most working professionals. Okay. A score of 711 years of work experience from PSC. What are your chances at IMD and judge? Again, Navjot, I can't answer that question because, those, I don't know what you've done during those 11 years at a public sector unit. I don't know why you're doing an MBA. If you've done some amazing things where, for example, if you worked for ONGC, which is a public sector utility, I think it's a public sector utility in India, then and you've worked on $100 million projects and successfully executed them, then yes, absolutely, IMD and judge will take you. But on the other hand, if your experience is where you've not had much professional growth, then that score of 700 is not going to help you. So that's my response. So just 11 years, a lot of people think numbers are profiles. Numbers are not profiles. Achievements are profile. When you select the 5 schools before giving the GMAT, how do you make sure that you get that call properly? You just decide what you want to do for your MBA and choose 5 schools. And, if you get them wrong, then you can still send it to more schools. In fact, with the enhanced online GMAT, you can send it to infinite number of schools free of charge. What exactly makes a good profile? Leadership. Leadership. What is a good profile? Evidence of leadership. If you look at any of our interviews, let me just share this one. Here are 3 of our students. Let's just go into videos and see. Here are 3 of our students who are talking about how do you portray leadership and or what makes a good profile. They are the 3 biggies: Harvard, Stanford, and Wharton. So this is what will help you understand what makes a good profile. Curative studies, I don't know of that, unfortunately, Simran. I'll have to defer it to someone else. What's the value of GMAT if you're applying to a master's in data science and business analytics rather than an MBA? Actually, I think the value of GMAT goes up because it's a much more analytical program. So I think that 720, 740 would definitely be very, very valuable over there. So an MIM program, the GMAT starts to become much more valuable because, again, you don't have that much work experience to show anyway. So yeah, I would say it's much more valuable than what it is for your MBA. Okay. All right, guys. With that, I want to thank everyone for joining me today. And it was a pleasure hosting you. Again, as I said, we have the Number Properties webinar tomorrow. Also, I want to make sure you go through the content in the free trial, so do that. And don't forget to connect with me on LinkedIn. With that, I want to thank you guys for joining me today. It was a pleasure hosting you guys, and have a good rest of your evening or rest of your day if, like me, you are in the US.